but it's also dominated by hunger. And the two are interlinked to one another. Food insecurity in Africa is the result of a confluence of factors. Degraded state of land and water resources in much of Africa is undermining production. Lack of agriculture and nutritional knowledge traps people into production systems that further degrade the natural environment and human capital. Prevalence of crippling diseases keeps families impoverished, and poor infrastructure leads to significant losses during and post-harvest, and restricts market access, thereby putting farmers at the mercy of middlemen in the transport sector. And lack of access to capital further prevents farmers from investing in their land, in farming equipment, in storage facilities, and transport, and provides or processing options, and further restricting them to the option of selling raw materials to middlemen who govern the conditions and price. Large farms can provide smallholders through outgrow schemes and contract schemes with access to markets, access to knowledge such as low tillage, no tillage farming, mulching and composting, integrated pest management, access to inputs as well, seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and access to capital for investing in the land. They can also provide security to from external shocks. And the benefits, in turn, can increase productivity and income for smallholder farmers that can deliver at scale and in volume to markets. All of these things contribute to food security in Africa. Is this the only way to improve the lot of smallholders in Africa? No. Some of the same things can be delivered through government extension programs, donors, civil society, but the private sector can do it at a scale which the others struggle to meet. Does that mean that there's no role for government, civil society, donors? No. The foundation needs to be set for the private sector to play a role in bringing farming solutions to food security at scale. And the foundation consists of informed decisions on where farming can and cannot happen in a landscape, secure tenure over land and water resources, clear rules of the game for things like on-farm and off-farm resource management, and application and use of inputs, and the relationship between larger farmers and smallholders, and mechanisms for enforcing those rules of the game. We use a participatory, transparent, inclusive land use planning process informed by ecological, socioeconomic, and institutional attributes of the area as a tool for establishing that foundation for investments. Land use plans provide the means for creating a shared vision for the landscape, coming to agreement on mosaics of resource uses, which will deliver on that vision and establish the rules of the game. They are also in many parts of Africa the way to secure land tenure, which is one of the key ingredients to successful management of land use decisions and investment. Such planning processes are best framed by national laws and led by local government, and they often require the support of donors and the facilitation of civil society. So there is, in my view, a role for the private sector, but there's also an urgent need for scaling up our efforts to build a foundation for participatory, transparent, inclusive land use plans for agriculture and conservation in Africa, particularly in the areas that are targeted for growth corridors like SADCO. So I think you could probably guess my answer to the role that corporations should play in our food systems. There is clearly a role for corporations in our food systems. And that role is to be the economic driver of transformational change for agriculture in Africa. The private sector has the reach and the skills to increasingly the interest to improve productivity of farming in Africa. But how corporations engage in the farming and food production sectors in Africa is a question that's still being answered, and the rules of the game are still being set. And I urge the conservation community to engage with that process now, to ensure that those rules of the game include clearly defined safeguards for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and water provisioning, carbon sequestration, soil fertility and stability and pollination, and equitable terms for vulnerable groups, including in particular smallholder farmers. The standards and certification processes that have emerged over the last 2 decades are leading the way to helping to ensure that such conditions are met. And increasingly, one of the developments that's happening in many of those standards is the expansion to include landscape approaches as part of the requirements for the standard, which is positive. So those standards should be the foundation for moving forward with the transformational change for agriculture in Africa. A last word on the question of livestock systems. Many of landscapes where we work are pastoralist systems, and the pastoralist systems are changing rapidly for a number of reasons. Issues of land security and title, ways of safeguarding themselves against the impacts of climate change in response to the loss of historical lands, meaning that pastoralists are increasingly taking up agriculture as part of their livelihoods. They're also increasing their livestock herds as a way of safeguarding themselves against the vulnerabilities that they're exposed to in climate change. If you lose 80% of your herd, 80% of a herd of 100 is greater than 80% of a herd of 10. But that's having devastating consequences on the natural resource base in much of sub-Saharan Africa. So there need to be options that are viable options for pastoralist systems in the region. And these are emerging through investments in value chains that are increasing the value of each head of cattle rather than increasing the number of cattle as a way of creating resilience in the system. But they cannot be prescriptions. They need to be options, doorways for pastoralist communities to choose to move through. Because livestock for pastoralist community is more than just a head of cattle. It's a way of living. And those options need to be something that they choose to move forward through for themselves. In conclusion, the UN DESA report and the process that has been involved in producing it brings us a long way in finding the areas of consensus and the future of sustainability in food and agriculture. These areas resonate in the African continent, where agriculture and pastoralist systems are on the verge of radical transformation. The foundation needs to be urgently set for the right conditions for farming solutions to emerge in Africa, for solutions to bring food security, to safeguard and restore ecological systems, and to sustain and nourish people.
Great, thanks Andrea. And again, the format, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk, and then we'll have some reaction amongst each of them, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. But we'll hear from each of the panelists first. So, Ilva, would you like to?
So you'll hear that actually I will echo most of your comments. That's very reassuring to hear. I thought I would give you a quick overview of what Syngenta does, what we do, and give a corporate view of this even more. All right, like this. Is it better? Yep. Good. Otherwise I can scream. Oh. Okay, so Syngenta is an agriculture input company. We're about 26,000 people employed in about 90 countries around the world. We develop solutions to help farmers produce more from less, so using less natural resources to produce more food, feed and fiber that we need. So managing ecosystem services and biodiversity is at the heart of what we do. We work closely with farmers, supporting those who actually are the real ecosystem managers or stewards of the land out there. They're the ones who produce the food, the feed, the fiber that we need. And that will sustain us, hopefully, in the future as well. So one can wonder, why is this important to us? Obviously, biodiversity, land, water are all the fundamentals of agriculture. And better knowledge on how to use this sustainably will create more sustainable markets, which of course is an interest in a company like ours. The population growth, increasing urbanization and so on, we know that there's more stress on these resources. So what we are working on is to develop solutions that will create, I'm sure you've heard, more crop per drop, but also more crop per hectare or acre, and more crop per other input unit, whichever you use to choose. So pretty much produce more from that. What is important here is to create systems and solutions that are both environmentally responsible but economically viable for the farmers who have to implement this. Otherwise, it will be very hard to create an uptake on these new technologies and management practices. So to do this, we need to close the gap of the technology uptake at farmers all over the world. But not just technologies in terms of seeds or crop protection products, but also understanding knowledge, extension work, best management practices is what we need. So the key is to get the right technology or knowledge to the right farmer. And there's no silver bullet in doing this. There's no one solution. And coming back to some of these areas and the lack of consensus in the consensus areas, smallholder farmers is absolutely critical for food security. The most food insecure countries are the ones who are also based on smallholder farming. So if you look at India, has more than 85% of their farmers are smallholders. In Africa, I think some of the numbers are more than 80%. So, and they produce about 25% of the total food, and they support about 2.3 billion people. So 500 million farmers we're talking about. Clearly, they are part of the solution. But to feed a growing population, there's so many things and hurdles that can get in the way. We're talking about doubling food production in certain parts of the world in order to actually be able to feed 9 billion people by 2050. And just as Andrea said, there's a role to be played by governments, by investors, by NGOs, by IGOs, by companies in getting there. And we're talking here about infrastructure as well. Access to markets, access to finance, access to tools that actually take out the risk in the system. So creative insurance solutions for farmers to be able to actually reinvest in their farm, to have some kind of a shield if they have a hard or bad year, that they are not standing there without any possibilities to reinvest for the next growing season. So there's a role for us to play in all of this. And I thought I will keep my comments brief here because I think there's a lot of opportunities for discussion coming forward. But what I want to sum up, and here I'm echoing Andrea's comments completely, the biggest challenge we have right now is to feed the growing population. It's going to take all farmers we have, large, small, medium size. We're a long way away to figuring this out. But all of us need to be part of this solution. So it's not a one type of organization, one show. We need governments to be willing to invest in their infrastructure and have plans for how they want to build and develop their countries, and create such policies that are actually implementable and have an economical interest for farmers as well. We need international organizations to help rally up all the different players in these markets, and we need NGOs to help get things moving on the ground. And you need companies to actually develop and innovate the right type of technologies. And public innovation is really important. So, however, farmers need to have access to the best technologies in order to do this. Because we're not getting more land, that's at least the plan. We're not getting more water, and we have to produce much more. This is pretty much my sum up of what the key pieces that I would like to have as a basis for conversation.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Ilva. We'd like to turn it over now to Ibrahim Thao, who's with UNEP, to provide sort of the big picture perspective from not the entire UN, but in the work that he does with UNEP, working with governments and others on these important issues as well. So, Greg?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Of course, I'm young.
Of course you are.
And of course, agriculture matters to all of us. So what I'm going to do is just to give you a very brief introduction, and hopefully we will have more discussions that I hope will be lively. Why is the United Nations Environment Programme having any interest in agriculture? Because I cannot talk for the UN in general, and there is no single view in the UN about agriculture and food security. There is a diversity of view. And the Secretary General of the UN has set up a high-level task force on food and agriculture, precisely to bring together all the actors in the UN, from the FAOs of the world to the World Food Programs to UNICEF to UNEP, to all the actors actually have an interest, and certainly we in UNEP have an interest on agriculture. Not because we have any mandate to produce food per se, that is the mandate of other organizations, but actually to look at the long-term solutions that need to be there in order to continue to feed the world. And as we all know, we are expected to be 9 billion people by 2050. And according to many statistics, including from WWF, we may need more than 4 planets if we continue with the trends, with consumption patterns we have at the moment. And we all know that we only have 1 planet. So where to go? Traditionally, agriculture, debate on agriculture is structured around 4 pillars. Availability, access, utilization, and stability. And we in UNEP, we fundamentally think that there is a 5th pillar that is crucially important as the 4 ones, which is the environmental foundation of food security. It is crucially important, this is why we upload your report, to yes, think about the short term and how to feed the world now, but it is equally important to think about the long term. How much water will be there by 2030, 2050 to continue with the current patterns? Will we have enough land? How much forest do we need to deplete? How much grazing lands we need to transform into farming lands if we continue with current patterns? Of course, we are not advocating that the 9 billion people will not be there. The question is, how can we feed them without depleting the fundamental resources that are the capital, our capital? You know, how can we continue to eat without depleting our capital? And there is no single solution there, but one of the options that we think the world needs to look at very, very seriously is the whole chain in terms of sustainable production and consumption. Do we know that at the moment only 43% of the cereals produced in the world are consumed by humans? We human beings, we only consume 43% of our cereals. Where does the rest go? 57% are gone somewhere. One, we need to, and this is a fundamental question, because for us it is not necessarily to expand the crop lands. It is not necessarily to expand agriculture into new lands. It is to see where can we make some economies in order to actually continue to feed the world. And surely there is some scope in the 57% that we are not consuming at the moment as human beings. We have a lot of pre- and post-harvest losses that we have to look at very seriously. It is very, very important, including in Africa, and mostly in Africa, actually, post-harvest loss. In the poorest countries of the world, the small farmers that we are talking about, most of their harvest is actually lost before they get to the market, and they have very little access to the market. Do you also know that most of our cereals are actually used to feed animals? Is that sustainable? So it is important to actually, think about that. 57% somewhere. If we were to reduce or to increase the consumption by humans of cereals to maybe 50%, that will be a big step forward. So we don't necessarily need more land, but we need to rationalize what we produce. In UNEP, we also think that the whole issue of energy production or energy linked to production and consumption needs to be taken care of very, very seriously. The drama that we have as human beings is that we work by sectors. So the sector that is in charge of agriculture is not the sector that is in charge of energy, is not the sector that is in charge of transport. And yet, we need the whole chain to work together if we are to be successful. At the moment, we have more or less 1 billion people, 1.2, 1.5, according to some statistics, of people that have no access to food, decent, that are not eating correctly, even though we have another billion people that are overweight, but that's another debate. We have 1 billion people that do not have access to sufficient food at the moment, and yet we know that there is enough food in the world actually to feed everybody at the moment. So that we need to look at. We should not just continue to push for more production. We should actually see what is